professional conversationalist or not, I thought it would be interesting to begin by hearing from the two of you who did know David, who had met him. You, David, spent time in a coast van. You played chess with him. Tell us something about him.
He was a very poor chess player.
Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's when you talk to, it's kind of, I didn't know if I could talk about it, but then when I was talking to other people who knew him, you know, I'd kind of take him aside and say, did you play chess with him also? And they'd say, yeah, he just couldn't get it. he loved to play chess, but just not a great chess player. But what he did play,
like bad openings or what?
you know, to be frank, I mean, really, I would say
We're among friends.
Well, problems in the opening, I'd say problems in the middle game, problems with the pawn game, and then problems with the end game too. But of course, I mean, you know, what he talked about though when he was talking about talking to a new person and then writing, he said that what he finds was very easy for him to do was playing this game of conversational chess, which is kind of, if I say this, what will it make you say? And if you say that, then what can I say to get you to say the thing I want you to say? And he said that now in personal discourse, that makes things very difficult, but in writing, that's the thing you really need. And he just, as a person, he just sort of couldn't have been more charming. He was, when I was growing up in New York City, David began publishing in Harper's Magazine in sort of the early ~90s, and he was so charming that when he came to Manhattan, people would brag about having seen him. So before I went out to Chicago to drive down to Bloomington, Illinois to meet him, I had the sort of the great good fortune of my girlfriend had been visiting me in New York, and she was writing an email to Harper's. And so I saw the email, and David was described as very handsome, sort of hulking, athletic man who wears a do-rag and participates in the urban experience thusly. Is unmarried, I believe. What were your other questions? He was someone who everyone who met him just kind of wanted to spend more time with him. And that was my experience spending time with him as well.
Rick.
What's the question now? I forgot what the question was.
What it was like? What was he like? What do you remember? Yeah.
I mean, everything David has said is completely accurate from my point of view. I'm trying to think what sort of other tonal colors were in there. I mean, for one, he was incredibly brilliant and sort of engaged with arts and literature and music. So he's really fun to talk to about that kind of stuff, which is mainly the kind of context in which I knew him, you know. I remember one night in the 80s, there was a guy in New York who was editing the Village Voice literary supplement for a while called Lee Smith. And he knew all these, you knew Lee, right? He knew all these younger writers. And so one night he took out to dinner David Wallace, Jonathan Franzen, Jeff Eugenides, me, Donald Antrim, and there were even a couple others, and all at one table, and it was sort of a shocking experience for me, the amount of intellectual firepower at the table. But chief among the dazzling moments in that conversation was David Foster Wallace quoting from Don DeLillo's novel America, which had not yet been re-released, from memory. He knew the DeLillo's first novel so well that he could quote whole passages from it, you know. So it was that kind of an intelligence to me, and I really looked up to it. That's why I wanted to sort of, as David said, spend more time with him. Really.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you about the first time I met him. You know, I get to shiver and shake on a weekly basis when I know I'm going to get to talk to Susan Sontag or Joan Didion, people that I've been told, you know, will eat me alive by the end of the interview. But I was more afraid because I had read Infinite Jest and it bulldozed me. I mean, I was what is the word? Prostrate before it. And I was so eager to meet him because, sometimes, does this happen to you? I get afraid that no one's going to be writing the kind of novel I love anymore, that no one's going to know enough to write that kind of novel, that kind of Ulysses novel or Gaddis novel, John Barth novel is going to be, gone because of that people will no longer know enough to surprise and astonish me. So I'm scared silly. And he sits down, and I mean, how do I do it? What's the first thing you say to someone whose work just devastated you? I never know, and I never know what my first question is going to be, and I don't make notes, and I don't like notes, and I don't want to bore anyone. So I said, I wanted to talk to you about fractals. I'm no good at openings either, chess or otherwise. And he goes, what do you mean fractals? And I said, well, I hear that, that if you take any length of coastline and compare it to any other length of coastline, that ultimately, if you reduce the units small enough, they're the same. He said, they told me you were a brilliant reader. So, he gets my first, devoted smile, like a Labrador retriever. He says, yes, I wanted to make a novel that would be based on an impossible-to-achieve geometric figure called, what is it, David?
The Fibonacci gasket, is that right? Yeah. Yep.
Say it louder.
Yeah, I'm actually going to get it off my phone just to make sure we have it, but you guys keep going and I'll say it.
Well, some kind of gasket or other. And he said he had a picture of it, a poster of it, on his wall as a child, and that it looked sort of like a pyramid on acid. And that he wanted to see if a novel could be shaped like that. He said, describe what you detected. And I started to describe this novel. And he said, practically under his breath, so I only heard it when I re-listened to the interview after his death, he said, would you adopt me? And that began, what was, we were in touch for the remainder of his life, and there was no one that I liked more because he was so generous and funny and good. From time to time, I would get a note, you get a note from David Foster Wallace. I mean, what has he done to be so lucky? And better still, it says, I have the feeling that you think that I think that you think I've offended you. I hope not. Never would try to. Honestly not. No, let's put this aside forever. And I'd think, what is he talking about? How could he have offended me? I mean, no, never. He was every bit as self-conscious as his writing. And I often felt that he, because of that, had a lot of trouble living. And I don't know, but I'm a fellow depressive, and I'm a fellow former misuser of substances, but in particular, in my case, alcohol. So we had a good deal to talk about because we both felt that we were repenting a former life that could never be apologized for sufficiently. And that was one of the most impressive things about David. Many people wish that they could still be drinking and or using, but for him, it was really the beginning of a new life that he'd gotten when he came to us as a writer. And that was really thrilling to me. There was no one that I know of as self-displaying as he was in his writing. But one of the things he displays is how much, everyone is self-conscious. He simply had a whale's share of self-consciousness. And why? Because he was a genius, He was an American genius. Not only that, he was a tennis champ. He was. He was a remarkable person who felt that he couldn't compensate enough for the former tragedy of his life. Now, you teach him. How do students respond to him?
As I'm listening to you talk about him, I'm trying to put the description of the character together with the work. It makes a lot of sense. One of the things I'm not yet hearing, though, is that there's a tension in the work. There's the wildness, there's the drive of the sentence, there's the attention to addiction, the sensitive, almost unbearable treatment, unbearably moving treatment of the human inability to stop desire. That translates into a wildness in the fiction. Then on the other hand, there's this intense logic. There's the snootlet. I get the feeling that David was a snootlet, and he says so. And so that logic, it comes together with that wildness and makes something incredible. And so, I'm kind of curious if you ever saw that in dealing with him day to day, that the snootlet, the attention to saying the right thing exactly.
I just want to say, first thing is a Sherpansky casket.
Sherpansky's casket. Okay.
We were on the airplane, and as we were flying into Minneapolis Airport, the voice came over the PA and said, "Smoking only is permitted outdoors." And David, who was a smoker and a grammarian, said, "Smoking is only permitted outdoors. Smoking is not the only thing that's permitted outdoors." So yes.
That's a perfect example. Great. Yeah.
He loved to stack opposites together. I remember that the thing that I couldn't stop laughing at, I think it's one of the funniest jokes in Infinite Jest. It's an exam question that asks the students in the exam to solve the following problem. What is a kleptomaniac to do if he's also agoraphobic? And the answer to this question is mail fraud. Something so conceptually complicated that he reduced to so few words.
I know.
That's a real snootlet.
Absolutely. That there was a phrase quoted from that you quoted, Rick, in the story you were reading, an intuition of the askew. That I thought, that's him. That's David.
Line.
Yeah. The askew and all its craziness. Also thinking today in preparation for this, that there's troubling news in the world, and I just feel, one, we have now David's gone. He can't comment on it. And he might be really pissed off that we don't comment on it. He would be here, wait, why are you talking about me? And I say that only because this is about David, but he was so much in the world, noticing everything. Everything was relevant to the point where, your head can ache reading him. Everything is interesting. Everything is relevant. But, just right now, I think he'd have important things to say in response.
Yeah, absolutely. In this new book, The Pale King, one of the things, he spends a whole chapter having a chorus, essentially, of IRS agents talking about what it's like as you realize that your life is so insignificant that after a certain point you're simply going to die, that you're not going to be remembered, that you're not very important after all. And I think even though David was, the creator of some of the most important works of literature of our time, I think he felt that way, that that life was a preparation that said to you, get ready to be humble, get ready to be humiliated, get ready to be squashed under the heel of time. Oh, you see, you can't see, but several of our eyes are shining up here because it's very hard to talk about a friend who's gone. How did you feel when you heard the news, Rick? What did you do?
I don't know, Michael, that I can talk about it. I sort of can't. And I guess I had mixed feelings about coming to talk on a panel about David for that reason. And I came finally because, and I was talking to you this morning about The Pale King and how great it is. And one reason that it's so great for me is that I can hear the voice of somebody I really cared about again, Since I too have the misuse of substances past problem, that was also an area where I knew David well. And it was a subject that we talked about over the years. And it was incredibly painful to me that the help that I think is out there for people who have the illness that you and I and he had sometimes can't get what they need, So I have a lot invested in my own life in the idea that art and sobriety are things that have enabled me to go forward and keep doing what I do. And the idea that someone that I really cared about and looked up to, like a sort of a literary older brother, couldn't find those things. It was terrifying and very upsetting. Yeah, that's the only way I can talk about it.
Me too, and absolutely. You see, when I had come back to Los Angeles when my father died, and one of the only one I really wanted to talk about it with was David, because many people will say, "I'm so sorry," or they've learned the socially acceptable things to say on that occasion. But David, in conversation, would really make the effort to try to help you with an impossible situation. It's almost as if he was put here to take that kind of thing up. You know what I mean? And I left him a message. I guess it was almost like, I want to talk to you about fractals. I call him, David, my dad died, and I can't think of anyone I want to talk to more than I want to talk to you. Would you call me? And he wasn't the kind of person who wouldn't call back. His sense of honor and responsibility was such a shining example to me, because there are many calls I don't want to return, and I get scared and stuff like that. And I loved him for being able to say and stuff like that and show that a writer should be as gifted at being inarticulate as being articulate. And he didn't call back, so I got worried that he something was wrong, or maybe he was on leave. He taught at a local university. And then 2 weeks later, I heard that he was dead. And while I was reading this book, when David makes that appearance in the foreword that you read, I didn't even bring tissues, and I knew I was going to cry. When he made the appearance in the foreword, I thought, maybe he's still alive, because the book so much feels like he's talking to you, talking directly to you, and that he knows you real well. And I thought, wouldn't it be so wonderful if it turned out it was all a hoax, that he was writing a seditious and dangerous book about the IRS, and that he was only secretly, that he'd gone underground or something, or had plastic surgery, and then when the book was published to all of what will, I hope, inevitably be the best reviews he ever got in his life or after, that he would pop up, and say, oh, I'm so sorry I had to fool you, and I spent hours not being able to convince myself that it was a fantasy because I wanted it so badly. I knew no one more charismatic and who achieved that state of charisma so simply. He wasn't a show-off or anything. He was like a koan, a Zen koan. You?
Me. How I felt when I heard that David had died, or?
Yeah.
I had also thought that I just had not believed it was true. David is the kind of writer, because he's so striking and original, that people would kind of do hoaxes about. There had been a story that the Onion did, that David Foster Wallace writes 70-page breakup letter to his girlfriend with footnotes. And there's below the story in the first column that said that his ex-girlfriend had read the first few pages but didn't really have time to read the rest of it, and she was looking forward to it after break. So I was hoping, when people started calling me, I was hoping it wasn't true. And then when it was clear that it was true, I called a friend of mine. And David is, the thing that I find painful as a reader is that David has acquired sometimes the reputation of being a difficult writer, but he is the easiest writer. I mean, you could hear from what we were reading tonight, he is just the most fun writer. What's difficult about David as a writer is that it becomes hard to read other stuff. If you've gone on a jag of reading his things and you try to read other writers, they seem awfully kind of flat. They don't seem as intelligent. The paragraphs kind of don't seem as full. And so he had readers everywhere. And there was a friend of mine who was a captain in the Army who had retired. He had served 2 terms in Iraq, and he was at law school. And so I called him because I knew how much he had come to love David's work. And so he was at one of those sort of welcome to law school parties. And he walked out, and he was standing outside somewhere in Palo Alto, and I think in the rain. And we were talking, and we were crying on the phone. And what he said is kind of what Michael was saying. He said that some things that happened to him on his second tour in Iraq that he had found perplexing, and he didn't know how to feel about them. And whereas with his rational mind, he knew that he would probably never sit down with David Wallace, in his reader's heart, he said he'd always hoped that he would someday have that moment to sit down with him, and that if David had talked about it, David could have told him how to feel about those experiences. And I don't think there are a lot of writers who would have people all across the country that way responding to their loss.
Yeah. Well, I apologize to all of you because I'm sitting here realizing David would far rather be remembered as an artist than as a suicide or an addict. And it's because of his great art that we read him and knew him. I wondered, Joanna, what was it like to find his work for the first time when you first read him?
Well, I guess he felt to me most of all, very American, capturing the noise of the culture in a way that seemed rare. I would say that when I read a writer like David Foster Wallace, or across the spectrum, who would be the most radically different, say J.M. Coetzee, writers so different from him. I would hope that the two do complement each other, that one doesn't exclude the other. And I did get that feeling from David's work that the capaciousness of the imagination seemed to want to prompt us to go out there and look around and read and take note. And I always feel amazed just at the things he notices, from a little a billboard to a scribble on a napkin to the things that are so easy to overlook. And I love the feeling when art gives me that, when it tells me, start to notice things. And so I think that's what, in spending time with the work, I think that's really what I treasure it for, take away from. My brother actually is a total, he's one of those, he sleeps with infinite jest under his pillow. He just, it's defining for him in a way that I think your friend, the soldier, seemed to feel too, and not just a writer who is helping you see the world, but a writer who can help you understand yourself. So that's been interesting to watch too, to see how that a family member goes through with the addiction to David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, because I've been taught, as a radio host, and I never know what people are thinking or feeling. J.M. Coetzee, in case you don't know his work, his first novel was Waiting for the Barbarians. He's an African writer, white African writer, whose work is among the most profoundly complex and difficultly moral work being written today. He was the winner of the Nobel Prize. I just wanted to make sure everyone knew. Did you, Rick, want to write like him?
No. But I actually think, in some ways, that I do. And not because I was imitating him in any way, but more that I sort of feel like history throws up certain models for how to make literature at various points to fulfill certain needs. And that some of the things that culture needed David Wallace for, it in a tiny way needs me for too. And by that, I suppose what I mean is a certain idea of the line, paragraph construction that's based on longer sentences, certain ideas of voice. I think his influences and my influences are very similar.
Who are they?
Well, I mean, he comes out of experimental writing of the 60s and 70s, which I certainly do too, Although I remember talking to him about Gravity's Rainbow at one point, and he seemed to have not very much interest in Pynchon, actually, which I found fascinating. But so I sort of felt like we were coming from a not dissimilar spot some of the time. For example, I wrote a story with footnotes in 1994 that was in my first collection of stories. Technically predates Infinite Jest in some way, and nobody ever believes that now. But, Nicholson Baker was doing it at the same time, obviously, with The Mezzanine, a book that was very important to me. And so I think there's just a way that literary history requires certain things in order to say what it needs to say. Nobody can be as smart as David Wallace about philosophy and literature. I think he's an end point in the current moment for how to think about those things. So it'd be impossible to write like him. Nobody can. But the model that he makes indelible for me and made indelible for me from the moment that I heard him read at Dixon Place that time was that if you didn't use your intellectual life to the utmost of your ability, you were, tying an arm behind your back as a fiction writer. And I had come through a period in the mid-'80s when I was in graduate school where the model for how to make fiction was what we talk about when we talk about Love by Raymond Carver, which was not work that I was capable of imitating in any way. So David sort of blazed onto the scene and said, I'm going to use all the cylinders. I'm going to fire on all the cylinders, and you'll be amazed at what I know, And so that was a very attractive model to me, who had been somewhat reviled in writing workshops for not being able to write blunt little sentences about working class life in the Pacific Northwest. I wish that I could have written those, but
I can't believe that happened at Brown, though, of all places.
not at Brown, but at Columbia, it totally happened, yeah. So that was the value of David for me. There's no room to stylistically imitate him, I don't think, but there's a lot of room to sort of follow the model and say, my ambition is for my work to be as smart and, uncompromising in the matter of intellectual life as I can make it.
David and Joanna, I knew Rick and Joanna's work before, and I make it a practice. I think it's not respectful to talk to a writer without knowing their work, although other people don't feel this way. But so I read David's fiction, and I know Joanna's fiction. Both of you are writers whose work is very, very different. Rick Moody, at least, has written an enormous novel in 5 Fingers of Death, so that impulse is there. But I wondered, see, because this is something I can never know, and maybe it's a question, David was a reader and profoundly influenced by Wittgenstein, and for Wittgenstein, the problem is you can never know the contents of another mind. That inability to communicate goes way down deeper, that it's essentially a form of radical skepticism. But I wonder often what it's like for writers to encounter a writer who's so different from your own sensibility, who you nevertheless respond to and love.
That's the story of reading for me. I mean, everybody, from Chekhov to James, and then you turn the corner and there's Virginia Woolf, and then there's Dickens, and then there's Flaubert, and wait, where was I, Everyone is so strikingly different. So that's why I would hope that we accumulate models and not exclude in our, the celebration of what David has done.
But I would say in David's case that although he may have loved academic philosophy, and his father was a philosopher, so he had sort of like the family store. That what makes him so appealing and attractive, I think, is not that, but actually that he does, even though his subject matter might be different, there was a great excitement when he started publishing, because he sounded the way, when we flatter ourselves, the way most of us feel we think, the way we find ourselves speaking, that we can be sort of cursing and then also talking about or thinking about Wittgenstein or talking about a TV show, and having all those thoughts coming at once. And in prose, it tended to be sort of segregated before that, and he put those streams together. And that was why when Infinite Jest came out and when the essays began appearing, people were thrilled, because it suddenly sounded, what David said was that he described prose voice really as like a brain voice. And he said the great thing about fiction is that we're all kind of locked into a self, and that fiction is the one way you can kind of leap over that wall of self. And I think that his prose is uniquely capable of doing that.
I want to thank all 3 of you for what you brought and what different things you brought, and for being willing to go as deeply and sit in whatever feelings of wretchedness or joy come up when thinking about David. I really enjoyed talking to you all, and I want to thank this large audience for coming and hearing talk about such a beautiful, difficult, and thrilling writer. And you know, the books by the writers here are available out in the lobby, so will they be, and I thank you all for joining us tonight.